Let's try a little thought experiment. Imagine you've spent years building the perfect fortress. You've got 100,000 of the most disciplined, most ferocious warriors on the planet. Your weapons are ready. Your spirit is unbreakable. You are waiting for the fight of a generation, a glorious, decisive battle that will cement your nation's destiny. So you wait, and you wait, but the enemy, they never show up. Instead, you just see their ships, tiny specks on the horizon, sailing right past you. It's as if you and your mighty, unbeatable fortress simply don't exist. Now tell me, what's more terrifying than an enemy storming your gates? It's an enemy that decides you're not even on the map anymore. Today, we're diving into a military strategy so psychologically brutal. It didn't just aim to defeat an empire. It aimed to erase it from relevance. This isn't just a story about battles. It's a deep dive into the sheer terror of being ignored. Now this right here, this isn't some public statement for morale. This is a secret fear scribbled down in the private journal of a top Japanese commander, Vice Admiral Jinichi Kusaka. And he's at Rabaul, which was basically the Pearl Harbor of the South Pacific, one of the most powerful fortresses on Earth. And look at the word he uses, strangling. He's not talking about an honorable fight. He's not describing a heroic last stand. He's describing suffocation, a slow, silent, helpless constriction. It's the feeling of running out of air. This one sentence written in the dead of night captures this creeping horror that was beginning to set in all across the Japanese high command. So, to really understand why a man like Kasaka was so terrified, you first have to get inside the Japanese mindset at the time. They weren't just defending a bunch of islands. No, they were defending a sacred perimeter, a spiritual and military wall they called the Absolute National Defense Zone. And the whole plan was to make the Americans bleed for every single inch of it. You see, the Japanese high command looked at the Pacific not as a vast ocean, but as this giant chessboard that they completely controlled. Every single island was a fortified piece on that board, what they called an unsinkable aircraft carrier, just bristling with heavy guns and packed with elite troops. They were absolutely convinced that the Americans would have to attack each piece one by one in a straight line. And at every single island, the plan was to inflict such horrific, gut-wrenching casualties that the American public back home would lose the will to fight and demand peace. It was a really elegant plan, but it was built on one single fatal assumption, that the Americans would play by their rules. And the crown jewel of this whole grand strategy? It was a place called Rabaul. We're talking about 100,000 elite soldiers and sailors. 100,000. The harbor was choked with anti-aircraft guns. They had 5 massive airfields ready to launch hundreds of fighter planes and bombers. They'd carved miles and miles of tunnels deep into the volcanic rock, connecting hospitals, command bunkers, and huge supply depots. Rabaul wasn't just a military base. It was a symbol. It was a projection of immense power, designed to be the unbreakable anchor of their entire defense. This quote from General Imamura, the top commander at Rabaul, just perfectly captures that supreme, almost arrogant confidence. He truly believed his fortress was invincible. You have to understand, he wasn't just expecting a fight, he was craving it. The entire Japanese military doctrine, rooted in the ancient Bushido code, was centered on this idea of one glorious, decisive battle, where their superior spirit and willingness to sacrifice would always triumph over America's brute industrial force. They built the seawall, and they waited for the wave to crash. But what happens when the wave just never comes? This is where the whole story turns on its head. This is where the psychological warfare really begins. Because the Americans looked at Japan's perfectly arranged chessboard and decided to just flip the entire table over. Instead of launching these massive, bloody frontal assaults on the strongest points, they chose to ignore them. Why shatter yourself against a seawall when you can just sail around it? This new strategy, which came to be known as island hopping, wasn't about capturing every fortress. It was about making those fortresses completely and utterly irrelevant. Seriously, just stop and think about this for a second. Put yourself in the shoes of one of those soldiers. You've got 100,000 warriors, all trained for this one climactic, honorable fight to the death. They were at peak readiness, their spirit is soaring, and then day after day, week after week, nothing. The enemy they were sworn to destroy just sails past, out on the horizon, getting closer and closer to their homeland, and acting as if they don't even exist. Can you imagine the psychological strain, the corrosion of purpose? It's immense. This quote from Major Hatano is just absolutely chilling, because it marks the exact moment that this horrifying new reality began to sink in for the Japanese. During a campaign on an island called New Georgia, the Americans fought like hell to capture a single airfield.
But once they had it, they just stopped. They didn't bother trying to conquer the rest of the island. They took the one thing they needed to build their next stepping stone toward Japan and simply left thousands of Japanese soldiers to basically rot in the jungle. The message was crystal clear, and it was devastating. You are not the prize. You're just an obstacle we can go around. You don't matter.
And this is the really crucial part. The island hopping strategy wasn't just some clever maneuver on a map. No, it was a fundamental shift in the entire philosophy of war. It transformed the conflict from a clash of warriors into a cold, hard battle of logistics, of supply chains, of spreadsheets, and industrial might. And that was a war Japan was completely, totally unprepared to fight.
Just look at this table. These numbers, pulled directly from captured Japanese reports, they tell the whole story. It's like watching an autopsy of a fortress in slow motion. In November of '43, Rabaul is a fully supplied, powerful base receiving 30,000 tons of supplies. By December, American air power and submarines are tightening the noose. It's down to 18,000 tons. By January, only a tiny trickle can get through via submarine. And then, by February, it's zero. The Japanese High Command itself cuts Rabaul off, realizing it's a lost cause. The mighty fortress had officially become a prison. And if that last table was the autopsy of the fortress, this one reveals the devastating human cost. While all those big guns sat silent, a much more insidious enemy was at work inside the walls. Without medical supplies like quinine, malaria and dysentery just ran rampant. Rations were cut again and again, forcing soldiers to forage for jungle plants, many of which turned out to be poisonous. Look at the combat readiness. This elite garrison just collapses, not from enemy bullets, but from enemy inaction. They weren't defeated in a battle. They were being defeated by the jungle itself.
Captain Genda. Now this was the tactical genius who planned the Pearl Harbor attack. He absolutely hit the nail on the head here. The Japanese military culture, it was obsessed with perfecting the art of a glorious death in battle. But the Americans, they were perfecting the art of supply. While Japanese garrisons were counting their last few bags of rice, American construction battalions, the Seabees, were pouring concrete for new runways on islands the Japanese had written off as worthless. Time itself had become an American weapon.
And this brings us to what was perhaps the ultimate psychological blow. For a warrior class, a culture that valued honor far above life itself, what could possibly be worse than a meaningless death? Well, the answer turned out to be a meaningless life. A life of pure humiliation, where their skills, their training, their entire reason for being were rendered utterly useless. Let that number really sink in for a moment. 300,000 soldiers. That's more than the entire population of a city like Pittsburgh today. An entire army, with thousands of tons of ammunition and years of fortified positions, was effectively removed from the entire war without a single major invasion. They didn't become casualties. They became liabilities. They were just mouths to feed, consuming precious resources the empire could no longer afford. This is a real official order from the very same General Imamura, who had boasted that the Americans would shatter themselves against his defenses. Now he's not evaluating his commanders on their combat skills or their kill counts. He's evaluating them on how well they can grow sweet potatoes. The mission was no longer about victory. It was just about survival. The mighty, unsinkable fortress of Rabaul had become a massive prison farm. And right here in this gut-wrenching private diary entry, we feel the deep spiritual cost of that humiliation. Colonel Kishimoto just perfectly captures the essence of it. For a culture so steeped in the honor of the samurai warrior, being forced to become a farmer while the enemy sails past to attack your home, well, that was a fate far worse than any battlefield defeat. It was humiliation born from total irrelevance. But these brutal, painful lessons that were learned by being bypassed, they didn't just fade away. In fact, they forced a horrifying evolution in Japanese defensive strategy, one that would lead directly to some of the absolute bloodiest and most desperate battles of the entire war. On a tiny volcanic island called Iwo Jima, we see the direct result of this evolution. The Japanese commander there, General Kuryobayashi, had studied exactly what happened at Rabaul and other bypassed islands. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he could not win. So he changed the very definition of victory. He abandoned the whole idea of a glorious battle on the beaches. Instead, he ordered his men into a massive network of underground tunnels. He forbade wasteful, suicidal bonsai charges. His new goal was chillingly simple: kill as many Americans as you possibly can before you die. Make the price for this tiny island so horrific that America would rethink the idea of ever invading Japan itself. The strategy of irrelevance had taught him that the only value a fortress has is the price an enemy must pay to take it.
Admiral Ugaki's words bring us full circle. The Japanese warrior code, the Bushido, it had 1,000 answers for how to die a glorious death. But it had no answer for how to live a shameful life. It had no answer for being ignored. The Americans hadn't just defeated their armies. They had defeated their entire philosophy of war. They had found the one thing a Japanese warrior could not fight, being made to feel like they didn't matter at all: erasure.
So what's the big takeaway here? What's the lasting legacy? Well, the island-hopping campaign literally rewrote the rules of modern warfare. It proved that you don't have to capture every single piece on the board to win the game. It showed that boring things like logistics and supply chains can be more powerful than any single battle. And maybe most importantly, it demonstrated that the psychological part of conflict, the act of making your enemy feel hopeless and irrelevant, can be the most devastating weapon of all. And this really is the haunting final image. When Japan finally surrendered in 1945, those 300,000 men were still there, on those bypassed islands. They had survived the war, but for what? They were trapped not just by the American blockade, but by their own warrior code that forbade surrender. The war hadn't defeated them, it had simply forgotten them, leaving them as ghosts on islands that had already been erased from the maps of strategic importance.
And that really brings us to our final question, one that goes way beyond World War II. Think about it in business, in politics, maybe even in our own lives. What causes more lasting damage? A direct, head-on attack that you can fight back against, or being made to feel so insignificant that you are simply bypassed, ignored, and left behind? The island-hopping campaign suggests that the quiet, creeping horror of irrelevance might just be the most powerful weapon of all.